Welcome to Agenda. I'm Nate Hughes, Stratfor's military analyst, and I'm here with George Friedman to discuss the tensions in the Strait of Hormuz.
The tensions are building. For a year now, we've been predicting that when the U.S. withdraws from Iraq, we're going to reach a crisis moment. We see the Iranian sphere of influence expanding into Iraq. Assad, who is more dependent on the Iranians than ever, is not falling yet. It's not clear that he will. We're looking at the possibility of an Iranian sphere of influence stretching from the Afghan border into Lebanon with Hezbollah. Obviously, the United States, the Israelis, and others want to resist this. And obviously, the threat of airstrikes, not just against nuclear facilities, but against the Iranians, is an option. The Iranians have carried out exercises showing, or trying to show, that they can close the Straits of Hormuz if they wanted. And since then, there's been a series of things, such as an assassination of an Iranian scientist, Geithner's visits to various countries trying to get them to play ball in the sanctions, and now reports about a buildup of U.S. Aircraft carriers in the region. So let's first take a look at the maneuvers. How do you read them? How effective was the Iranian Navy in carrying out that operation?
The naval operations, as opposed to the one scheduled for February, which will be more of the asymmetric, unconventional work by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, were a full-spectrum set of operations, including the Air Force, conducting everything from mine-laying operations to missile tests, boarding operations, all across the spectrum. The question is not whether Iran can muck up the works in the Strait and very easily set tensions skyrocketing. The oil spiked 4% just with the exercises, and there was no closure at all. But militarily, the question really is not can they muck up the works, but how long it would take to clean up the mess.
And did we get any indication from that, from the exercises, how long they could sustain it?
A lot of their capability in terms of air defense is focused more on the lower altitude. And as far as you get below 3,000 feet into trash fire, you're talking about a messy place. And because minesweepers necessary to really clean the strait can't even go in until the anti-ship missile threat, the small boat swarm threat, and the air defense threat are all dealt with, you're talking about a very messy scenario.
So the U.S. now reports yesterday is beefing up its forces in the Persian Gulf, its aircraft carriers.
Right.
How seriously do we take this?
The USS Vinson arrived recently to replace the USS Stennis, which has been there for the better part of 7 months. Right now, the USS Abraham Lincoln is on its way to the region. Now, this all fits within the normal deployment patterns of the United States Navy in the last 12 months, where they're maintaining a 1.7 presence of large deck carriers in the region. But the fact of the matter remains that the U.S. could very easily have 3 carriers in the region, with the USS George Washington stationed out of Japan, only 10 days steaming away.
And 3 or 4 carriers are enough from the Navy's point of view to become some sort of operations. So clearly the Iranians, who are going to be fascinated by the fact that this is a standard rotation, are going to be more fascinated by the fact that the U.S. now has 3 carriers in the region.
Right.
In the meantime, Geithner is traveling the world trying to get everybody to agree to the sanctions, particularly on oil, on financial matters and other things. The Chinese clearly are not going to play ball. The Russians may or may not, and whether they carry through on it, it's going to be very hard to use sanctions to really shape Iranian behavior. There's a covert war going on. Who is waging it is unclear. The 2 candidates are Israel and the United States. But an Iranian nuclear scientist was killed in a pretty sophisticated assassination. Clearly, there's a covert war going on designed both to limit the nuclear process, but also it's a war of nerves. I mean, everybody in that program has got to be wondering who next. What are the chances in your mind of this all getting out of hand? In the sense that going to places that nobody really wants to go to, such as the closures, Straits of Hormuz, where Iran doesn't want to get bombed, or all these things. But with all these things building up, we now have the crisis we expected.
Right.
Our model also said that each side had too much to lose from open conflict and would maneuver away from it But as we learned, all the best laid plans don't always carry out. How do you read that?
Well, one of the other key parts of our analysis on the whole tensions between the United States and Iran has been the deterrent value of Iran's ability to threaten the Strait, which hasn't changed. What has changed over the years is the deteriorating global economic circumstances. And the problem is, the United States has the capability to bomb Iran and meaningfully set back its nuclear program, though there's a lot of risk in terms of the intelligence problem, what they know, how well they know it, whether they can really hit it. But the real question is, right now, with the global economic recovery so tenuous, can the U.S. risk upsetting that? Because no matter how well it manages the Strait of Hormuz in a military sense, it has no ability to manage the market's reaction.
But there's another question, which is it about the nuclear facility? Which is, I'll argue that nuclear weapon development is still a ways off. The real issue is Iran's covert power in the region, as well as its conventional forces, which we could have a long argument about how good they are, but they're there, and we're not. And that changes it. So to really affect the Iranians, the U.S. would have to carry out airstrikes on their conventional forces. And that's not a 2-day operation. That takes a long time.
Weeks or months, at least.
Weeks and months. Hence the movement of the carriers in the region. The question of whether or not the Turks would allow us to operate out of Incirlik, what other air bases we could use for a campaign. But it's in that context of trying to taking a long-term campaign that the question of the closure of the Straits really becomes important.
One of the other deterrents we've talked about a lot has been, until very recently, the presence of a residual U.S. military presence in Iraq that was essentially hostage almost to Iranian proxies. And
a tripwire like Berlin was during the Cold War.
Exactly. And while we don't have the military, the United States doesn't have the military capability there anymore, there's a 20,000 strong U.S. diplomatic presence there that is still hostage in the same way.
The difference being they can't even buy themselves a couple of days.
Right.
The diplomatic presence is liability. So. The Iranians, the real question is how far will the Iranians go in risking this? And the real question is how far does the United States think you impress the Iranians? And these are where the miscalculations can occur. So our forecast continues to be there probably will not be a war, but we are now moving into the heart of the crisis that we expected. And that crisis is about the balance of power in the region and Iran's desire to change it in its favor and the Americans' desire to preserve the existing balance of power without the same commitment of forces.
And Iran's window of opportunity to consolidate its gains in the recent years is closing.
Well, it has to calculate that it will not be there permanently. Now is the time to act, and this is where the danger comes from. And finally, the oil markets are starting to realize it. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, George.